about buyers? How are buyers feeling?
Testing audio. Everybody hear us okay?
Where is she? Are we good?
We're all set. Oh, wait, hang on.
All right, everyone. Ooh, I'm still echoey. That's a little too much. I don't want to hear myself.
Where's that coming from?
The mic? Am I too close to the mic?
You shouldn't be.
That mic has a green light on it.
Yeah, that should be on, but I don't know where the audio is coming from.
All right, try from there.
No, Colin's still.
Is it coming from behind here or is it coming from here?
The echo is coming from the TV.
Why am I getting audio off the TV? Everything's muted. Test.
Now try check.
No, we're still echoey.
Yeah, he's muted.
Sorry, everyone. Just give us a second for.
Yeah, I will in a second. I haven't.
Is the mic on the webcam too? What's
The mic is on, yeah, but
for the
I shouldn't be getting audio from back here. Okay, so we'll have to keyboard.
All right, guys, we'll get started in just 1 second.
Testing for echo. Still there. That's so weird. Where's the audio coming from? Oh, that's weird. Sorry, everybody.
Nope, we're good. Do you want me to let them in the waiting room?
I think they can hear us.
Yeah, but if they're getting an echo, like we're getting an echo, it's gonna be really distracting.
Yeah, it's gonna be a problem. Test.
Okay, everyone, we're just working through a little technical difficulty. We have a really bad echo for some reason, so we're gonna get started in just a second. Hey, Colin, do you see this explanation point on audio?
Yeah. I don't think that should. Testing again.
That's it.
Hey.
What would we do without Colin? All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much for coming. For those in person and those online. Colin is monitoring any questions that come in via Zoom. So just let us know. I always feel different because I have people behind me that are watching from the camera. And then if you have questions that we don't know the answer to, Michelle will be taking those down because a lot of this new law has some gray area in it. So we want to take the questions that we're not 100% clear on and take that to our attorney. And you guys always ask such great questions. When we did our last class, one of the questions kind of stumped the attorney, and she's like, you know what? I need to dig deeper into the law and find out about this. So really feel free to ask questions. And then what we'll do is after we get answers back from the attorney, if there's something we don't know, we will email that back to the group. So we're keeping track of what the questions are. So to just give you a preview of the class, basically with the new law that is passing January 1st, real estate firms, brokers, are required to enter into a broker service agreement, okay? Now I'm going to tell you up front, I'll probably fumble that a few times because it's a new terminology that we're using. But a broker services agreement is a listing agreement or what we would have called a buyer agency agreement. So we have always had the practice that if we're listing a property, we have to have a listing agreement. Now that same rule applies to buyers. Also, the term dual is now going to be limited dual. There is complete transparency with compensation. I get a lot of questions like, do I have to do this? And do I have to do that? And how should I handle this? And the first question you should ask yourself always is this legal and ethical? But is it transparent? Would my buyer or seller be able to understand what's happening, how compensation is taking place? This is all about transparency. And then last, the goal of the law is to modernize and simplify the real estate brokerage in Washington. So we're going to call it the pamphlet. For those of you that were in my last class, they don't have a name. It used to be the agency law brochure, and it doesn't have an official name now, but it is referred to as the pamphlet. Okay. And so they really kind of simplified that. So oftentimes when things in real estate happen, and I've been around for a while, even when interior digital photos came out, and we were like, oh my gosh, people aren't going to need us anymore. Oh, now they're on the internet. Now Windermere can advertise our listings, right? There's been all these paradigm shifts throughout the years, and there's going to continue to be. But I think something that I've learned over this time is when there are these shifts, where are the opportunities, okay? So some of the opportunities that I think that is very important is having a stellar buyer consultation, okay? A lot of you put a great deal of time and energy into your listing presentation. You have a marketing plan. You can go and you can talk to a seller. You can do your CMA, and it is on point. But now is the time for your buyer consultation to be just that. Many of us, when we put a home on the market and we're meeting with a seller, we go through our marketing strategy. Seller, this is what I'm going to do to help get your home sold for the best price and the best terms. Well, now you should have something like that for a buyer. What does your representation mean? Because a lot of buyers think that your value is in opening a door, when we all know it's so much more than that. So this is an opportunity to really dial in your buyer consultation. Educate your database and farm, okay? The only thing the people are hearing about is these multi-billion-dollar lawsuits throughout the country. And real estate agents might be going away, or the sky is falling. What's going to happen? Like, no one really knows what all this means. So this is an opportunity for you to be the voice of your database and the voice of your farm, so you can let them know what's really going on. And these laws are here to protect everyone. When it comes to your broker service agreement with a buyer, okay, I know there can be some angst, especially for our newer people that sit a lot of open houses. It's like, but what if they won't sign? What if you have a buyer that's just not willing to sign? And I think it, in a way, protects you from not wasting your time with someone that's not really willing to commit to working with you. If you hire an attorney, for example, before an attorney will represent you, they have to give you what's called an engagement letter. And it basically will break down the cost of the service and the scope of how they're going to help you. I am not going to an estate attorney to help me with the land dispute, right? So that attorney has to give me an engagement letter with the cost and the services that I'm basically paying for. So you have to look at your buyer representation agreement in a very similar way. Buyer, before we start working with one another, we need to identify what this means, terms of compensation, and the scope of the work. Okay, so it's just a few opportunities to keep in mind on what you can do with this new information. So some of the changes, and we are going to be going through the forms, but the bottom line is to receive compensation for rendering real estate services, you must have a broker service agreement, okay? If you represent a seller, you're not getting paid if you don't have a listing agreement. Now, that sounds funny even saying that. We would never think, how could we get paid? Why would we even have a listing without a listing agreement? Well, now the same is true for a buyer, but you have to have it before or within a reasonably practical time. And that's where it gets a little bit nerve-wracking for some folks, okay? Before or reasonably practical, what does that mean? Any thoughts?
What?
Before or reasonably practical. So if you're my buyer and I have to have this service agreement, this buyer agency agreement, before or reasonably practical.
I would say you would have to have it done before you submit any type of offers on their behalf.
And that is definitely a hard line in the sand. Okay, you could never have it after you write a contract. Always has to be before. But before reasonably practical, you're supposed to have it when you start rendering real estate services, when you're providing real estate services. And then this is where it gets a little bit dicey. So we're going to go through the contracts, and then we're going to talk about some different scenarios. When you're doing reasonably practical, you also have to take in account the individual, right? We can't be at an open house strong-arming people to sign a contract, right? We are in no way like mafia, waste management service, right? We are going to take account their feelings as well. So we're going to jump to the buyer broker service agreement. And again, I apologize if I stumble it. I've been calling it a buyer agency agreement for many years. So we've highlighted some sections. Usually when we have new contracts, I always give you guys the red line versions. And to just be really transparent, there were so many red lines, it was hard to read. So I went through and printed out, this is still a sample form, it's not finalized by the MLS, but highlighted some areas to point out. So the term is now a default of 60 days. Now you really need to think about that when you're meeting with a buyer, and every buyer is different, okay? But if I'm helping a brand new buyer that maybe is a past client or I have a great relationship with them, from start to finish to get a buyer into contract in 60 days could be really tough, right? Depending on that situation. However, if I'm in an open house and Burnell walks in, I don't need any kind of contract to show Burnell the property that I'm holding the open house. But if Burnell says, hey, I've seen some other homes around the corner, I'd really like to see them. And we'll talk about scenarios. But when it comes to this time frame, if I'm to the point where I need Burnell to sign the service agreement, I could just do one day. Right? If I'm nervous about that, I could do a day and I could always extend that. So this 60 days is a default, but you can go greater or you can go down to one day. And that could really be advantageous to you if you need it. Limited dual agency. Okay, so that's a new term. We used to just be dual. Limited dual is really telling, and I actually really agree with this aspect of things. But to tell the buyer and the seller that if I represent you both, I'm actually limited. Because I can't help the buyer with any kind of decision making or negotiation that is at a detriment to the seller and vice versa. So it puts me in a limited capacity. So for limited dual agency, they have to, both buyer and seller have to sign. Okay. Firm limited dual agency. This would be Michelle and I. So if Wynn has a listing and Burnell happens to have the buyer for that listing, they are not limited dual brokers, but I am in a limited dual broker position. So it explains the difference with that dual agency. Section 5, Colin.
We have an online question.
Okay.
Curtis is asking if it matters if the expiration occurs during a transaction prior to closing.
If it automatically extends, if you're in a pending transaction, so let me repeat. If your contract says 60 days and on day 45, you get to mutual, but you're not going to close, let's say until day 75, the contract automatically extends until you're closed if you go pending in the middle of the term.
Yeah, it says that right there. Yeah, the term shall automatically extend.
Yes. So compensation, the compensation is broken down. You really need to read the form thoroughly and practice how you're going to present this to a buyer. Section 6, the seller compensation offer, okay? A seller may, but is not required to offer compensation to the firm for representing the buyer and the purchase of seller's real property. Seller offers disclosed in the listing shall be stated in the purchase and sale agreement and may be accepted by buyer on behalf of firm in the purchase and sale agreement. And then it gives you options. So if the seller's offer is equal compensation, okay? So I'm going to say, because this has been drilled into my head, I'm going to do my best to not talk about percentages, okay? So I'm just going to say my fee, my Shy Bundy fee is $25,000. Okay. Section 6 is going to break down different scenarios of if the seller's SOC is $25,000, if it's equal to my fee, what does that look like? And then what if the seller's offer is greater? My fee is $25,000 buyer. But if the seller offers $30,000, then what happens? Is it paid to the firm? Is it credited to buyer? Is it credited to seller or other? What if the compensation is less? If my fee is $25,000 and the seller is only offering $20,000, does the buyer pay the balance? Do we request the seller to pay the difference or other? Okay, so when we say this is about compensation transparency, I mean, this is pretty darn transparent. Okay. Now we have compensation terms. The compensation is.
Spend some more time on number 6.
Oh, yes, do you have a question?
Well, be a lot of scenarios, maybe some seller says, I will pay 0. Right? So I guess you have to have a conversation with the buyer ahead of time that they could be obligated if they want to buy that house and pay the commission.
Absolutely. So then that would be a situation where the compensation is less than what your fee is.
Yeah.
But then what's your plan? Now, we'll get to this part down in section 8 with what if the seller's 0, buyer, do you still want to see these homes?
Yeah.
If some buyers maybe like, we have plenty of money, we got an inheritance, like we are prepared to come to the table with this amount. Or it's a VA buyer and they can't pay. So you are going to also in section 8 be discussing with your buyer, how do they want to handle properties with a 0 SOC versus an SOC that's less than, because I would say those are 2 different conversations.
Yes.
All brokers are different, right? Some brokers would say. If my fee is 25,000, buyer, my standard fee is 25,000, but if it's less, I would be okay with that. But if it's 0, I'm not okay with that, and that's when we have to discuss, maybe you don't want to see those types of homes because you're not prepared to come to the table. I do think, just like listing presentation, and everyone does it differently, but I have always felt that it's important to do the listing presentation to show your value, your marketing, what your strategies are, and then you talk about compensation. I don't want to know how much Win costs until I know Win's value. So I do believe that you should do your consultation about what they will receive by being represented by you before you get into the conversation of compensation. But I think this is one of those things where you're going to have to decide what is your business strategy, what's your plan, and then how are you going to navigate that?
Did not, potentially the buyer negotiate first, seller pay closing costs and then have more cash to come to the table and pay the commission.
Or you could ask the seller to pay for it.
Yeah.
So you could say, hey, buyer, if the commission is less,
Yeah.
I charge 25,000 and they're offering 15,000. We're going to check this box here that says we're going to ask the seller to pay the difference. And if it's 0, we're going to ask the seller to pay the difference. But in the event the seller says no, let's talk about what we should do.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Norman.
Is the service agreement part of the offer?
No.
What was the question? I didn't hear.
Is the service agreement part of the offer? So the service agreement is going to be like a listing agreement between listing broker and seller, or I always say it wrong. Buyer broker service agreement is going to be between the buyer broker and the buyer. Okay. When back to your question, in my last class, a lot of people talk about Lennar, right? Lennar is the one that's notorious for a 0% SOC. We've navigated that. Each broker has navigated that, how they feel is best for their business. So I think that conversation has already been out there, but now it's on paper and we're just going to talk about it ahead of time.
Yes.
So compensation terms. So I'm not going to get real detailed into that, but it goes over, like, there's a tail provision of 60 days afterwards, regarding, if something happens with exclusivity or non-exclusivity. But getting down to number 8, okay, that is showings, listings, and VA financing. So A, showing properties, buyer broker shall or shall not be obligated to show properties to buyer for which there is no selling offer and buyer has not agreed to pay commission. 2 seconds. It's important that you know that shall not is the default. And then you go to B.
One question on that
Hold
one.
on 2 seconds, because I have 2 questions, so I'm just going to finish the paragraph. Buyer broker shall bring listings to the attention of the buyer, regardless of seller's offer, exceptions. So if there's exceptions, so I'm Wynn's buyer, and I could say, okay, Wynn, your fee is 25,000. I have 10,000 that I'm willing to pay you. So if anything is $15,000 or less, I want to see that, or 15,000 or more, I want to see those homes. But if it gets under that, I can't fulfill your compensation. So don't show me anything that's under that amount. So you can have exceptions to the rules. And then VA, due to VA regulation, if buyers obtaining VA financing, the compensation must be paid by the seller. Bernard.
So the question that I have is 8A, where it says no seller offer. That seems like it's a very solid, black and white term, no seller offer. What if the seller's offer is less? So the term says no seller offer, but let's say I'm going back to percentages because I'm better with that.
Your percentage is 10%.
I'm a percentage type of person. So my contract is 2.5%, and then this is maybe the seller's offer is 2%. But this says no seller offer. So it's just very
Correct. So This is just covering the section for like Lennar, if it's zero.
If
Let's
it's
say
zero.
you're 25,000 and the seller is only offering 10, you would have discussed that up in this section to decide how you were going to handle that.
Right,
Either negotiate it,
Yeah,
win with a 41C.
yes, 8. Look at paragraph 8 to simplify as 0. Look at 6 as less than or more. It could be more. Colin,
A question from Robin. She's back at section number 6 here.
Okay.
Says, so you check the box that we will request seller to pay the balance. But seller says no. Do we check the box above as well?
or
Upfront. I'm a little unclear.
Do you
so
want me to just ask?
Robin, go
Yeah.
ahead, ask your question. I can hear you now.
So commissions, we charge 30, they offer 2,500. We check the box up front. Hey, the sellers may offer less. We will request the seller to pay the balance, but that still doesn't solve it. So we do request. And then on an offer, the seller says pound sand. Don't we need to check the box up above as well that states that the buyer will pay that delta?
I agree. Yes.
So you check both boxes.
Yeah, so you could, just as you articulated, hey buyer, if the seller is offering less, we could definitely try to negotiate that. But in the event the seller declines, we now have to talk about what that difference or that delta is.
So you should have, to me, you just do that once up front, and they agree to pay the balance and then decide if they think it's in their best interest to try to get it from the seller or have that fee paid by them upfront.
Correct.
Fine.
Yes, I'm gonna double check that with our attorney, but I'm 99.9%. That's how I interpret it.
you just can't do that with a VA loan. though.
Yeah, obviously, yeah, VA won't allow that. Colin,
We closed one with VA, and VA allowed the buyer to pay it.
this,
Yeah.
she's a trailblazer.
Well, this next question from Jonah references that. For VA financing, if seller does not agree to pay buyer compensation, can VA buyer decide to pay it regardless of 8C?
If the lender allows, yes.
Okay,
Yeah, because this isn't a real estate question, it's a lender question. And we're not experts in lender questions, but I wouldn't see why not. We have no problem with whomever wants to provide the compensation as long as it's within the lender guidelines. Okay, moving on to page 3. There's nothing in page 3 that really stands out as far as changes are concerned. 53. So before, when we had a buyer agency agreement,
one second, Chai.
yes,
Things are a little out of order on the packet. You go one more page, 53.
did I skip one? Actually, I'm sorry. I'm the one that skipped one. It's the front and back. I'm sorry, 41A. So we used to just have a buyer agency agreement, okay? And that was pretty much cut and dry. Now we have I would say it wrong. A buyer broker service agreement. I need like a BBSA. So we have the agreement, we have an amendment, and we have a termination. Okay, very important to know that there's 3. Now, the ones that we're reviewing are John L. Scott's. I'm sorry, our MLS's. But John L. Scott is coming up with their own contracts. We have seen the sample version of the buyer broker service agreement, but they are still working on the amendment and the termination, and they're coming up with one for teams. Okay, so the amendment, I think this form is going to be there's a lot of questions about teams and limited dual and what that looks like. So the amendment part of this is term extended. Okay, So we're gonna use this form if I already have a buyer service agreement written up with my buyer. And let's say I did 60 days and we're not there yet. We haven't found a house and everything is hunky-dory and I need to extend, okay? That's really powerful. What if I meet Bob the buyer at an open house and I think there are some other homes in the neighborhood that would work for Bob better? But Bob doesn't really know me yet. We haven't had a consultation, but I feel like I need to have this at some point. And again, we're going to go over scenarios in the end. But I could write up a buyer broker service agreement for 1 or 2 days. And then I'm able to do a consultation with Bob, and Bob and I agree to a long-term working relationship. I can do an amendment to lengthen the time of the contract. Okay. Agency relationship. I know this is a tough one. Exclusive or non-exclusive. Okay. This is not a new concept for us. But when would you ever use non-exclusive? Okay. And everybody has lots of feelings about this. Okay. But I think non-exclusive could be very powerful for Bob the buyer that comes in my open house. Because I know me. And if I'm looking at open houses and a buyer and a broker is like, hey, you have to sign this to go look at homes, I'm going to be like, wait a minute, this is moving really fast. But if somebody explains a 1 or 2 day contract that's non-exclusive, then that makes a big difference. But now 2 days later, Bob and I decide to work together. I can do an amendment to change us from non-exclusive to exclusive. Okay, so I think you have to use these options as a tool for different clients in different scenarios. Okay. Limited dual agency. Okay, that doesn't have to be signed. I know for those of you that were at our meeting with Annie Fitzsimmons, she said oftentimes we see an initial spot and we just jump to, oh, it has to be signed. So this can be signed after the fact. Maybe they didn't want a limited dual, or they did want it and now they learn more about it and they don't want it and they want to change their mind. Or maybe Bob the buyer isn't finding any homes and I happen to put a property on the market that I think would be a great fit. And I didn't think that would be a scenario where I needed the limited dual conversation. You should have the conversation up front, but you can amend that. And then compensation. You can amend the compensation agreement. So let's say, I'm trying to think of a good scenario. My fee is $25,000. I mean, it already says if the lender won't allow it to go back to the buyer, it goes to the firm anyways. But let's say you get into a situation where your compensation is $25,000 and there's an amount difference, whether it's a delta amount or an overfund amount. What can you do with that? So you can change the terms of your buyer service agreement. Now we have, yes, Norm.
I'm assuming that the MLS listing would still show an SOC of whatever that percentage would be or not.
You mean post-closing?
Excuse me on the MLS.
On the MLS, just the listing.
Yeah, the listing has to advertise.
So under other, could you just say as stated in the MLS listing?
Yeah.
Couldn't that be easier?
What if it's 0?
Okay, that's a good question.
When did you have a question?
Oh, under others, so. Could you have different brackets, like under $1 million, you could pay 3%, above $1 million, you could pay 2.5.
Good.
That's under other.
You could. Mhm. Termination. Before you could cancel your relationship with any type of text, email on both sides. Okay, so Bob buyer is a wackadoodle. I found out that he wants a 5-bedroom, 3-bath, beautiful home in Bellevue for $500,000. and I don't want to work with Bob anymore. So this is when you do the termination agreement. A best practice, in my opinion, is what if Bob's just not responding? You should still send this for electronic signature and save it. Okay, this is all about having a good, clean paper trail. All right, new listing agreement. Colin,
Jonah is asking, what happens to any compensation amount that goes to the firm? Is it applied toward the agent's cap?
like an overage amount?
Yes.
Well, it would be paid just in the same regard as the other commission.
So it's just like it goes from a 2.5 to a 3,
You're
just normally. Yeah.
just normally.
Okay.
Okay, listing agreement. Again, we have paragraph 4 that talks about the limited dual agency.
Are we skipping the 41 to 42C?
The back pages get me every time. Thank
Sorry,
you.
we're trying to
I
save
mean,
some trees.
no, I appreciate it. Sorry, everybody, I skipped. 42C, okay? Compensation disclosure. This is really important, okay? If any additional compensation is offered outside paid as offered, it must be disclosed to all parties, okay, before mutual acceptance. So what does that mean? Gary's listing is sitting on the market and Gary decides to offer a buyer broker bonus if the full price offer comes in before New Year's Eve. Well, I would have to disclose that maybe Gary's offering an extra $2,500 to the buyer broker. I would have to disclose that to my buyer. What if Wynn receives 5 offers on his listing and one of the offers credits the LOC some money? Hey, Wynn, if you accept my offer, I will lessen my SOC $1,000 and offer it to you as an incentive for you to select my offer. Okay,
Sounds dangerous.
it does.
Yeah, a little
And
bit.
again, I had to get creative thinking of scenarios. And this is one of the scenarios that I don't want to say we stumped the attorney, but she's looking into. Where's the question? If builders if I'm offering a referral fee, how does the 42C come into play with that? So she's gonna go deeper into the law. What if the builder is offering some kind of buyer broker bonus? Okay, so if it is outside what's on the MLS as paid as offer outside of the SOC, you now need a 42C.
Did we ever find out if we have to disclose that Starbucks card?
No, we did not. We'll find out.
The sandwich at the buyer broker's open. We have to disclose that.
Compensation disclosure is this part of the purchase and sale agreement?
Yes. Okay, now to the listing agreement. Okay, we've talked about limited dual agency. So just like it's on the buyer broker service agreement, it's on the listing agreement. And paragraph 5, to address any privacy or similar concerns, seller may instruct listing broker to limit marketing by not displaying the property address or map location on the internet, by eliminating any and all internet advertising, and by imposing specific showing requirements and other similar restrictions. So this is nothing new. It is just stated very directly on the listing agreement, okay? We all know how to handle that seller that doesn't want to sign, doesn't want to advertise their address, and doesn't want a key box, right? We know how to maneuver. Your home isn't going to get sold. So you guys are at a high enough level to maneuver the conversation. Now we get into the compensation, okay? Again, this is for sellers and we're still at complete transparency. So the listing firm compensation, we have a percentage or a set dollar amount. If the buyer is not represented by a buyer brokerage firm, the listing firm commission shall be X of the sales price or a flat amount. I pointed this out because this section, and we have a little arrow that says total LOC. I had a lot of brokers making the mistake of saying, okay, my commission is 25,000, but if the buyer is unrepresented, then my commission is 10,000. Thinking in their head, it's 35,000. But that spot on paragraph 7A2 is the total LOC. Okay, it's not an SOC. Buyer brokerage firm commission. So we have a percentage to a cooperating member of the MLS representing the buyer, which includes another broker affiliated with listing firm who represents the buyer. Okay. If the listing broker represents both seller and buyer, represents the seller and the buyer as a limited dual agent. So this is your dual agent line for 7B2. If checked, the offer to pay the buyer broker firm compensation shall extend to a licensed broker firm that are not members of the MLS. I think this is a very slim to none chance. This is not, I have not experienced it. I have not heard of this being a common issue. Or buyer brokerage firm compensation shall be paid as set forth above unless modified by the buyer and the buyer brokerage firm in a mutually accepted purchase and sale agreement. The offered amount may not be withdrawn or reduced with respect to a buyer after that buyer or the buyer brokerage firm has notified the listing firm or seller of the buyer's intent to submit an offer and for 3 calendar days after. Buyer brokerage firm is not intended a third-party beneficiary of this agreement. Okay, now, yes.
What if the buyer says they're willing to pay you the difference? They end up not having the difference.
And they don't have the difference? That's a tough one. I mean, I don't know how you get blood out of a turnip.
I guess. Is there a pre-qualifying process here?
That's a great question. We can double check with the attorney. I would make it a best practice to talk to the lender. Now, if I'm Wynn's buyer and I say, hey, Wynn, I have $10,000 that I'm willing to come to the table with for your compensation, that might be a good, like a best practice to run it past the lender. To say, hey, if they have to pay this $10,000, is that going to affect their loan in any way? Because I could see that being a bigger problem. They have the money, but the lender says, ooh, this could affect their debt to income ratio. And if you accept the money, it's going to kill the deal.
Yeah.
So we'll find out, but I don't think anyone's thought of that. Colin.
Ken Williams has a question. He's wanting you to go over 7A again and is wondering where the LOC is supposed to go on them. I think it's the 7A2.
Okay, so
One.
7AI is the LOC. Okay, if you charge 10% as the LOC. Okay. I know I can't say the other numbers. I charge $25,000 to list Wynn's house. But seller 7A2, in the event a buyer purchases your house that's unrepresented, my fee is $35,000. Because the buyer is unrepresented and I have to do all this extra work. Does that make sense, Ken? Okay.
Exactly. I'll let you know if he has any other questions.
Okay, sounds good.
Another question.
Yes,
So does General Scott have a standard?
we're not allowed to. we
So-
can't have a standard 6% commission.
I guess, let's say, listing office offers $500. And one of our agents agrees to do it for $500.
Well, when of all people, I didn't expect you to put me on the spot.
I you just channel Scott.
We are not a discount firm. We are a full service brokerage.
Yes.
And we combat, commission compression all the time. With most of our brokers, I mean, I do see a lot of 2.5%, more so now than I have many years before. I think the majority of our brokers have their standard, not the standard, okay? Of what that looks like. But our brokers are full service brokers. So I don't really get into the weeds between the 2.5% to 3%. But if I see any kind of a trend where a broker is accepting or charging $500, that's probably in an event where they need to go to Redfin or Western Realty because they're not being a full service broker for that amount of money. Does that help? Okay. I tried to say that in the best, cleanest way possible.
They're being converted. Just relax though.
Yeah. Are you a mole? Okay, where was that at? 7C, compensation negotiable. Seller acknowledges that there are no standard compensation rates and that compensation in this agreement is fully negotiable and not set by law. In addition, seller offering compensation to buyer broker firm is not required. So this is nothing new. It's now just being stated in the contract. Okay. 7F, additional consent. Seller consents to firm receiving compensation from one or more party and to sharing of compensation between firms, provided that any terms in the amount offered to or by the firm are disclosed and required by the RCW 18.86.030. Okay, again, all money, all compensation is very transparent. Okay. MLS, paragraph 9. This is nothing new, but seller authorizes listing firm and MLS to publish and distribute the listing data to other members of the MLS and their affiliates and third parties for public display and other purposes, subject to any restriction imposed by seller. Okay, so they say that in a few different ways if showings have, or if sellers have any kind of marketing restrictions, showing restrictions, things along those lines. Page 4 of the listing agreement is damages in the event of a buyer's breach. This paragraph has always been in, but it's been amended. In the event the seller retains earnest money as liquidated damages on a buyer's breach, any costs advanced or committed by firm on seller's behalf shall be paid, therefore, and the balances shall be retained by seller or divided equally between seller and firm. It's retained by seller if not checked. So in the event, so I'm just putting Wynn's home on the market and I'm saying, hey, Wynn, in the event the buyer breaches the terms of the contract and the earnest money is on the table, we're going to talk right now about what happens to that earnest money. Okay. All right.
Is there a John Scott standard on that one?
I would say no, because I think brokers invest different amounts of money into listings. So as we are full service brokers, some of us pay for staging, some of us have very low overhead, some of us have teams.
Right.
So I think it's more of a business decision of what happens. But I also believe, and this is just the personal thing, it's a relationship decision.
Yeah.
So if this deal falls apart And there's $5,000 of earnest money on the table, which is a very low amount nowadays. But if that amount of money is on the table, well, the hope is that Wynn is still gonna sell my home,
Right.
you know? Now, if there's a scuffle and Wynn and I may not be working together, Wynn may need to be compensated for the amount of money that he put out to initially sell my home. Sometimes we have those buyers that are, or sellers that are frustrated and they're like, I'm just gonna pull my home off the market through Christmas. Well, sometimes it's gonna be a business decision. If you say, hey, well, I need to have that earnest money that we talked about, you might not get that listing in January.
Yeah.
But I would say it's more of a personal business decision. Okay, a Form 18, right? This is an amendment to the listing agreement. So we have your term extended, an amendment to your price, agency and co-listing broker, limited dual agency, and then co-listing broker as a limited dual. So if you have a team, this could potentially be important, okay? As far as Form 18, if you have an active listing going into 2024, you have to have a Form 18 signed. Now, if your listing is pending, you do not need that. And at the end of the year, we will create an email with some friendly reminders of what to do in different scenarios for your transactions, because the contracts aren't even released yet. So you can't do it ahead of time. Yes, here.
So if no, when I for listing or how if somebody want to buy with me, so we want to remove me out of the co-listing agent.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Gary, because can we write that down for the attorney? I do think logistically you would use the form, yes. However, I think that's a slippery slope. I think Norm would not be a limited dual broker, but I think it would be hard to argue that you're not, because you already had a relationship with the seller. So that is a really, we'll talk to the attorney about that, but yes, logistically Form 18, if you were listed as a co-listing broker, and then you're gonna say, I'm gonna unplug from the seller and plug into the buyer, I think that's a slippery slope.
Question from Curtis. Is the use of a Form 18 now standard and replace Form 19 for a price change?
Ooh, great question. It's funny, Michelle and I, we always want to be in alignment with training and that type of thing. And Michelle has always done price reductions and extensions on a Form 18, and I've always done a Form 19, okay? So I wouldn't say there was a wrong way, but you could do both, or one or the other, I should say. Form 18, I think is a little more of a completed form when presenting to a seller for an extension or a price adjustment or something along those lines versus a Form 19, but you can do both. Yes.
I'll just say if the MLS is getting involved, a Form 19 is required. You can do both, but they will not. If you're going, for example, from temporarily off market back to on market with the price reduction, if you're going to have them do the price reduction, they won't touch it without the 19.
Yes. Now, and let me clarify
Yeah.
something. A Form 18 is only going to address what's on a Form 18. If you're doing a cancellation, a temporarily off market, something along those lines, then you have to use a 19. All right. The purchase and sale agreement, there are very, very few changes in the purchase and sale agreement, okay? So on page 1, line 16, agency disclosure, we have now said limited dual agency. Okay, so that's made very clear, it's highlighted there, versus what it used to say, so it's very clear. On page 4, because some of this is just the vernacular of their amendments of it. Section K. If a party is unrepresented, the email is sent directly to the party's email address specified on page 1 of this agreement. So we all know that the legal definition of delivery is going to the broker and the firm, or to the broker if the other party confirms receipt. Well, they address the situation of legal delivery in the event a party is unrepresented. Their email is now delivered.
Just by sending the email, it's considered delivered.
Yes, but it now states it in the contract. Page 5, agency disclosure. All parties acknowledge the receipt of the pamphlet entitled Real Estate Brokerage in Washington. Okay? Very important that everybody receives this every transaction.
Is that a place that we should have an initial?
So as a best practice, and I'm gonna go through some best practices after we go through the contracts. I think it would be very advantageous, almost like many of us used to do pre-listing agreements. Do a welcome email to a buyer that has all of that information along with maybe a lead-based paint pamphlet, the pamphlet itself, the law of agency brochure. And I would ask the buyer to confirm receipt or make sure you save the sent email. On page 5 of 6 of the purchase and sale agreement, section U, when it comes to compensation, the compensation offered to the buyer brokerage firm, if any, is set forth in specific term number 17. And then they added about sharing compensation between firms. So they have added a great deal when it comes to compensation. A buyer or a seller should never be able to say, I didn't know that, because it's in multiple places: listing agreement, buyer broker service agreement, and the contract. And then if there's anything additional, you have to have an additional form for that. So as far as how the chain of events should occur is the pamphlet or the brochure should be given as soon as possible, okay? And nowhere does the law state, it would have been great if they would have just put a little acknowledgement initial on that pamphlet. I would have really liked that, but they didn't. So you have to use your best practice. Some people will bring 2 copies and have buyer initial both. Some people will send it in an email and save that sent email or ask for confirmation of receipt. Some people have it in all of their buyer consultations, right? But you should have that. Then you should have your Form 41, which is your buyer service agreement, and then a purchase and sale, okay? So for existing contracts, and I know I already said this, but I'm going to say it again. For listing agreements that are signed before January 1st, and you're still active January 1st or later, you need to have a Form 18 signed. If you have a current mutually accepted contract going into the new year, and you represent the buyer, in order to get paid, you need a new buyer broker service agreement. Now, a lot of us are MLS contract nerds, and we love to read the legal bulletin. The legal bulletin is going to say different than what I just said. and I need you to really hear me. You have to have a new 41 signed if you have a pending contract January 1st or later. I've checked with a few attorneys about this because the legal bulletin says you don't have to have it. But attorneys say the law takes precedence over that and you do have to have it. And then, of course, if you have an active buyer that's not in contract yet, needs a new 41, okay? It's a little challenging because these contracts have not been issued. It'd be really easy to just say, oh, hey, buyer, we're starting to work together. I'm gonna need this contract January 1st. Sign it now, please. Can't do that. They're not released yet. General Scott's contracts are not released yet. They're working on it.
We have an ETA, and the reason I'm asking is I have clients that are coming in from South Carolina for this coming weekend. And usually when I start showing them houses, I have them sign the paperwork. It'd be nice to be able to give them the most current stuff and not have them go back and do something.
I agree. They keep telling me soon. So we've seen it. I believe it looks complete, but I don't know if they're making changes. If I were in your shoes, I would have my buyers sign a current Form 41 or the John L. Scott Buyer Agency Agreement and let them know there are new laws changing January 1st. They're revising the forms. Please expect me to have to get one more signed.
Closing December 28th.
Yes. Colin,
Let's say that all the forms become available on December 10th. If you have a buyer or a seller sign them on the 10th, is that enforceable from the 10th to the 31st, or do they take, like, do you need to get a new buyer?
well, I don't know because I think that is why MLS hasn't released the forms yet. They're looking very complete to me. I don't know what they would amend in there. John L. Scott is still working on theirs. I don't think John L. Scott has a strategy to withhold them. I think they're just not completed yet.
Okay.
So a couple things before we jump into scenarios, okay? Are teams considered limited dual agents if one member represents a seller and the other member represents a buyer? Okay. Attorney's response. If a teams are splitting up representation solely to avoid limited dual agency, we do not condone that practice. But if brokers are truly on the same team and they each represent each party, then the supervising broker is a limited dual agent and each broker represents their own party. Okay.
So there's three people involved.
Well, almost. So we're going to use Win as an example. Okay. Win has 2 team members on his team and he's the supervising broker. So if Luke represents a seller and Dawson represents a buyer, you are like in my shoes where you like limited dual firm type of thing. Okay. But I call them the boys. I don't mean disrespect by that,
No.
but the boys are not limited dual. Okay. But this is where it gets a little bit tricky. If the supervising broker is one of those team members, then they would be a limited dual broker. So if Win represents a seller and Luke represents a buyer, you're limited dual. Okay, so for all my teams out there, that's really important for you to know. A lot of our teams are 2 people, a supervising or team leader and a buyer broker. Okay. So team leader has a listing, buyer broker's doing the open house, buyer broker sells the open house, which awesome. Team leader's limited dual. Now, here's the thing.
Luke could be a listing agent, Dawson could be a buyer agent.
You have to supervise.
Yeah. But I think where it gets a little different is when you're a party. Okay. We already talked about, if another member of my team shows a house to my client, do I add their name on the Form 41 as other, Or do I need a 41A to add that broker as a co-buyer broker? Okay, so I represent Win as my buyer, and Burnell's on my team, and Burnell's going to help me, or I'm going on vacation. But we will have a John L. Scott addendum that addresses team members for brokers filling in for others. I don't have it yet, but this is what our attorney is saying. Yes.
Question from Jonah. To be clear, for non-team agents, when both agents are from the same brokerage office, that office, John L. Scott Renton, is the limited dual agent, correct?
Correct. Me and Michelle would be limited dual, not the individual brokers. Which is how it is now. Okay. If brokers will come and ask me questions, I'm like, whoo, don't tell me who's on the other side yet. Or other person go talk to Michelle, because I can't say anything about Wynn's buyer that could be detrimental to Burnell's seller. So it can be a slippery slope sometimes. You just have to learn how to maneuver it.
But that's not true if it's a different John L. Scott office.
Correct, because your license hangs here.
Lennox couldn't answer your question for you, but I could.
That did not mean to sound snarky.
Never.
Yeah, it's being recorded too.
On 41, I thought this was a really great question, so that's why I'm going to spend a minute going back to it. 41, section 8A. If the box on 8A of the form 41 is checked, shall not, should box 8B also be checked? And what should we write in there? Okay, so in the event that there's no compensation being offered, one of the boxes, so the attorney says not necessarily, 8A is about showing property. 8B is about providing the buyer with listings. So if shall not is checked in 8A, I still have to present the buyer with listings where zero compensation is offered by the seller, unless I write an exception that I'm not required to do so. Okay, so one's about showing, one's about sending information. A buyer could say, I don't want you to send me any homes where the compensation is less than your $25,000 price. But at least it's stated in writing and we agreed upon. Now we're going to talk. Colin.
Curtis has a question. Does that limited dual agency have to be disclosed if brokers are from the same office but not on the same team?
It already is disclosed on the buyer broker service agreement and the listing agreement. There's the section where it talks about limited dual, and there's an initial spot. And then there's a paragraph that below that talks about if the two brokers are from the same office. And there's no initials, but it's the firm limited dual. So there's a distinct difference, okay? And again, nothing new. It's just stated very clearly.
It is something you have to be able to explain to your buyers and sellers. So I work in the same office as Michelle, but we are not on the same team. I represent you, she represents them.
Absolutely. And I always tell buyers, and it's funny how a buyer will say something to you and it may stick with you. And a buyer said something to me very, very early in my career. I was actually working for another broker. And they were like, can you sell a Windermere house?
I get that all the time.
All the time. It's part of my presentation of how it works, just to kind of give them a picture because they don't know. And I would rather answer that question up front, as silly as it sounds. I heard of a broker one time who did not win in a listing presentation that they were competing against other brokers. And they called the seller and said, why didn't I get it? And he said, well, you didn't tell me the other broker's going to put a key box on the house. And so this is really where you have to fine tune your presentations and show your value, because all those little things we take for granted, people need to know. Gary.
just going back to Wynn's situation, if he's a team leader and he's a dual agent, right? Limited dual agent, and would that release you guys, JRS granted from being dual broker?
I highly doubt it.
So,
No, Win and I mean, Win in a sense would be the limited dual broker. He's in between that broker and firm, but all the same rules would apply. Colin,
Question from Ken. One second, hold on here. A lot of agents / investors have off-market deals. How does that apply to compensation?
it's no different. I mean, I think if you have an off-market deal and you represent the seller, you need a Form 47. And the commission is very clearly stated there. If you have an off-market deal and you represent a buyer, you have to have a Form 41. Okay? So if you hear anything, the law states in order for you to get paid, you have to have a broker service agreement. That could be a listing agreement, be a buyer broker service agreement, Form 41, or a Form 47, because that creates an agency relationship with a seller that's selling off market. If you don't have a service agreement prior to mutual, don't ask me what happens, but the law says you don't get paid. Now, the reason I say don't ask me what happens is because in this process, I contacted 4 escrow companies. And I said, hey, escrow, the law says if you don't have a service agreement, you're not paying our firm. So does that mean Wynn is going to close his listing January 15th? Are you going to require Wynn to send his listing agreement to escrow? And escrow said, we got nothing to do with this. Hands off. So I reached out to 4 companies, and Emmanuel Fonte with Access Home Closing stated the same. So the law says one thing, and we're not sure who or how that really means, what that means. We're still working through Sky Slope, okay? Because with Sky Slope, you need an address to create a transaction. So I meet Bob the buyer, and I have Bob the buyer sign a 41. I have 2 days to get that into Sky Slope. But how do I get it into Sky Slope without a property address? And I don't have an answer yet. We are working through that.
We have a solution. We're waiting for a better solution.
Yes. Yes.
Another question from Jonah. I'm not sure if I understand this, but I'm going to read it and hope you get it. Does the compensation to the second agent from the same office need to be disclosed? For instance, if the listing agent is collecting 4% for bringing an unrepresented buyer to agent from their office, does their compensation from that 4% need to be disclosed? How are agents having that conversation with sellers?
Can I read it?
Yeah, I think this might be the referral question that.
Does the compensation to the second agent from the same office need to be disclosed? For example, if a listing agent is collecting 4% for bringing an unrepresented buyer.
That would be another agent.
Yeah, that doesn't make sense, because if you have an unrepresented buyer, you'd only have 1 broker.
Right.
So, Jonah, we'll have to talk about that, because I think I don't understand your question. If somebody's unrepresented, there's only 1 broker, but the answer in a nutshell is yes. Any compensation has to be disclosed everywhere.
Yes.
If I'm finding out about referral fees, like if I refer Win, my buyer, do I have to have something separate written up that I'm getting 25% of whatever Win makes? Like I'm getting details on that still. So some best practices.
What happens when you're in a team and you have a split?
I think that will be addressed in the John L. Scott team contract. But that's a great question. I like that question a lot. So best practices, a welcome email to your buyer. Include the pamphlet, right? The agency law brochure, include a 41. Hey buyer, here's the contract that I have my buyer sign. Now, I'm not saying, this is just a suggestion, okay? This is not a recommendation to, some people want to sit down. I'm a face-to-face person. If I'm gonna have you sign something, right? I need to date you for a minute for you to love me. So you don't have to send that, but you could, right? You could send over your lead-based paint. You could send it as a welcome email, then send the contract for DocuSign or AuthentiSign. Okay. And like we talked about, if you have the buyer broker service agreement, I'll sign and I decide I don't want to work with Bob, the buyer, anymore. And Bob just kind of went MIA on me. I'm going to save my DocuSign email, or however we get it into SkySlope. I'm going to have a paper trail. Okay, that I sent that to terminate and Bob didn't sign it. All right, so the fun part, scenarios. When is reasonably practical? Our fabulous John L. Scott attorney said that her professor and her tort law class in law school said, reasonably practical is a venomous snake. Because it's very vague and it's very gray. So there's no right or wrong, but there are right or wrong trends, okay? So if Bob the broker has 5 transactions in the SkySlope and every buyer broker service agreement he has signed is on the same day as mutual acceptance, Bob is doing something wrong, okay? But they're all not going to be the same because every scenario is different, okay? So we meet a potential buyer at an open house. The house is not a right fit, but you know of a home around the corner. So you set an appointment to show a buyer later that evening. You show them the scheduled house, and then you show 2 more. They fall in love with house number 2 and want to write an offer. What do you do? And at what point do you do it? Who wants to give it a stab?
I only have a couple choices. One is before you show the other house, this, so we know the house is down the sign that 141 right there.
So let's put your I'm a new broker hat on.
Yeah.
Do you think Bob the buyer is going to sign a contract after meeting you at an open house?
Maybe one day.
But if you're showing houses that afternoon, at what point do you get that 41 signed?
I guess we need them there and have to explain how it works or have a consultation ahead of time. It's always best to have a buyer consultation before you go out, show any house if we can.
I'm a lot like Shy. I like to have the date before I have the signatures.
Yeah.
So this, and everyone's gonna be different because every person's different and I have to read how my client is going to, what I think, how they're gonna feel about me throwing a piece of paper at them. So now that I've shown them the first house that met them at an open house, not gonna have them sign anything. I'm gonna talk to them about what is coming and what are some things that we will have. And I'm just gonna kind of feel how the client is. And then we show the second house, they love it. We're within, now they have to understand I have to be a representative. I have to represent them. And the only way I can do that is by signing this paper first. And then I would have them sign it because it's in the same day.
Yeah.
If it's over a little bit longer period, I still meet with people, I talk to them, take them out for coffee. I might show them a house or two. And now we feel like we're a fit to work with each other. Then I have the 41 signed.
At what point in this scenario did you offer broker services?
The minute you showed them a house. It's,
When you open the door.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's a trick question.
Yeah.
Okay, the first thing you ask is, do they have a contract signed with another buyer broker? Okay, So when you set the appointment to show more houses, you should find out. Because of this exclusive, non-exclusive, it's always been an option, but I don't think never really a thing. I've never dealt with challenges with it. But I could see a lot more people signing non-exclusive contracts. So you need to know, is this buyer been working with another broker? And if so, what does that look like? Okay. When is reasonably practical? At the second house? At the first house? Just like Wynn and Burnell are talking about, there's no right or wrong, okay? Now, I don't think it's right to show them 15 homes. I don't think that, I think you could have had a contract signed. I don't think that's reasonably practical, okay? But maybe I show Burnell 3 homes, and Burnell is just not wanting to sign anything, okay? You have some options. Have a paper trail, send an email, send it for an electronic signature. Keep the emails, keep your paper trails. You could also opt for the 1 or 2 days. You could opt for non-exclusive. Hey, Bob, the buyer, I understand we just met. You want to see these homes? There's a new law that took effect January 1st that requires me to have this form filled out. But we can do this where we could do this for 3 days. We could do non-exclusive. You don't have to work with me exclusively. But once we sit down and do a consultation, I want to show you how I work, and then we can change the terms of the contract. Okay. If they don't sign it, okay, if you just found Bob the buyer is a bugger and he doesn't want to sign it, what do you think his willingness is to work with you?
That's a red flag.
Bingo. So for our new people, if somebody's unwilling, that means something. Now you might have to fine tune your approach. You have to look at what you're doing and how you're presenting. But if you get this bugger that's not willing to sign it, that's going to tell you a lot. Okay.
I was mentored by the first agent, John Scott, that says, you're not gonna wanna work with every buyer that walks into your open house. And there's certain people that just waste your time and run you all around.
Yeah.
They're professional shoppers,
Yeah, absolutely.
definitely value your time, might have to look and go with you to find the right one.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Scenario number 2. It's a lead from your website. Buyer is requesting information on a particular house. You set up a showing and you meet them at the house. Home's not a right fit. You continue to follow up, but it seems like the buyer's just window shopping, right? There's not a whole lot of interaction. The same thing happens a month later. They want to see another house. You set an appointment. They don't like it. And they kind of disappear again. On the 3rd month, it happens again. They want to see a house. You show it to them. And now they want to write an offer. What could you have done? When should you have done it? Gary.
I think you go back to the first one that Wednesday, you qualify them first, invite them for a meeting, if they not wanting, why we're talking.
Yeah. And again, there are gray aspects of this, and it's hard to say. I don't want to say there's not a right and wrong. Okay, again, you don't show 15 homes and not have a 41 sign. Okay, that's not okay. But all of it could be a little bit different. You know, if Burnell sells, if Burnell represents 30 buyers next year, and 5 of those contracts, his 41 is signed on the same day as mutual, that could be happenstance. But Burnell doesn't have a trend of all 30 being the day of mutual. And again, having a paper trail, that's what's going to matter. Now, regarding my scenario with this internet lead, they may have signed the 44 or the 41, but it's actually only good for 60 days, and you're on day 90. So the paperwork might be a little different. Because it may have expired and then you have to sign a new one or something along those lines. Just remember that having this buyer service agreement also protects you. Now, scenario number 3, this is the one that me personally is like, oh, I really got to think about this. A family member asks you to show them a house that's currently on the market that they feel is super overpriced. We really are interested, but it's $200,000 overpriced. So I guess we don't want to see it. But you sent them information about it. The next week, the price is reduced. Your family member wants to see the house and write up an offer. Okay. What do you do and when do you do it?
You have that consultation with the buyer and your family member before you start engaging in services. Just like
Absolutely.
anybody else.
Just like anybody else. Move.
This is a different question.
Okay, hold on one second. Just like anyone else, okay? This is where things tend to, it's not a problem until it's a problem, okay? I know it'd be like, oh, come on, just come inside and see. A family member, at least my family members, could give me some pushback. What are you talking about, Shy? I've done 3 deals with you. Why would you have me sign something now? So you need some type of script. You need to know what you're going to say to explain this. This isn't something you go out into this real estate world and wing it. Okay? But they're just like anyone else.
The new general Scott form thing to our broker services, it's gonna have a little wheel with little
Yes.
things on it.
Yes. I love that part
Yeah,
too.
that just makes it easier.
I agree.
That's pretty cool.
Now remember, just a friendly reminder, all contracts need to be turned into the firm within 2 days of a client's signature, okay? We're still working with Sky Slope as we talked about,
2 business days.
2 business days. Audits have changed greatly over the years. I haven't forgot about you, Boo. Audits have changed greatly throughout the years, and a lot of us, many of us, have gotten a little lax in how we do some things, okay? You have to turn it into Sky Slope within 2 days. You have to submit your correspondence, text messages, emails. A lot of people use WhatsApp. Colin Noya had a really great idea. When you open up a Sky Slope account, every single property has its own individual email address, okay? If you don't want to use WhatsApp right from the beginning, you can add the Sky Slope email address in a group text with your clients, and every text will automatically email to the Sky Slope account.
Can you repeat that again?
So every time you open up a Sky Slope account, you get an individual Sky Slope email for that property. So if you're working with Bob and Susie Smith and you have them on a group text message, you can add on that group text message that Sky Slope email account. And then every text message just goes.
Wait, that's active right now?
Oh, yeah. So that's been active. The catch-22 of all this is that would only apply once you get to mutual, because we don't know how it would be for you to get set up into Sky Slope before mutual without an address. That's the piece we're working on.
What was it listed?
Yeah, listing, absolutely. As soon as
Full
you,
mutual, I mean.
yeah, as soon as you put something into Sky Slope, as soon as you create a listing or create a transaction, every property has a individual address. So a lot of brokers, it's a common practice that any emails, that Sky Slope email address is on every single one, because then it's automatically done for you.
What do you think the advantages of WhatsApp opposed to text or?
So WhatsApp is,
You can email the string.
yeah, you can email the string. You can do it with one file when you're done with the transaction and just upload it and you're good to go. So that becomes easier. The downside is you have to remember to do that. And you also have to kind of talk your client into using it. WhatsApp is owned, I believe, by a Chinese corporation. So there's a bunch of people who are like, I work with Microsoft. I'm not allowed to have that on my phone. I work in security, something, I can't use that. So you might get some pushback on that. The text messaging option is universal. Anybody who has any text messaging, whether iPhone, Android, whatever, they can do it. The downside is they have to remember to use that group chat because it's got to be that one that they respond on every time for this to get.
Which could get buried.
It could.
I don't care if it gets buried. We can pull it out for the auditor if they ask. And if the auditor's like, this is a lot of text messages I don't care about, great, change the law.
What's after?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And here's the thing. This isn't new. We're just trying to come up with some helpful
Sure.
strategies, and we're probably due for an audit pretty soon. So we're preparing ahead of time, because it's a bit of undertaking. Vu.
Yes, so I think a couple weeks ago you had this class before, and I think this came up, but. So if I'm helping someone and I have whether it's a listing contract or a buyer service agreement, it's between me and the client. And I have someone else in the office open the door, like a inspection or something. That person we need to have.
Yep, hold on. Let me, this is our list of attorney questions. So the question, hold on, I'm seeing if we asked for two. So we'll get clarification on that, Boo, but for teams, that will be addressed in the John L. Scott contract.
Right.
But my answer to you is yes. Now what I would recommend is, let's say you have a list of 3 brokers that tend to help you on your team. Or, I don't know what the John L. Scott one is going to say. But I mean, you could have these pre-filled out and what your VU standard is for working with your buyer. You know, to say, hey, this is my buyer service agreement. Bob, Sally, and Susie all help me open doors once in a while in the event I'm on vacation or blah, 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 blah. And it's in there. I think right now in this, I mean, luckily there's 11 lawsuits across the country. Washington is not a party to any of them, and neither is John L. Scott. And I know we get a lot of pushback from brokers. Why does Washington have to be the trailblazer? I don't know if we so much are. 17 other states already require this buyer broker service agreement. Okay, so we're not trailblazing in that regard, but we're still able to work and function. Imagine being like in Missouri right now with this $1.7 billion lawsuit. So when in doubt, be transparent, right? It's like a seller disclosure. Seller, I can't advise you on what to disclose and what not to disclose, but Doug Tingval has always said, when in doubt, disclose. So I think if your practice becomes about transparency and really good paper trails, I think that is just a really best practice in today's world. Gary.
Probably this might not.
No, ask away. I'm so far ahead of schedule.
So what happened, what about WeChat? And with, Chinese.
So that advice applies to any other third-party program. So as long as your clients will use it and it can be downloaded and preserved, whatever you want to do is fine. As long as you can save it. So I would argue before you do it, test it, make sure you can download it. But as long as it comes out in a file that's like a text file or a CSV file or something that's readable, as long as we can download it and upload it to SkySlope, whatever works best for you and your business.
But most of the WeChat conversation, let's say Janie had, will be in Chinese. So probably have to translate it for the.
Maybe the DOL will have to translate it.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any stipulations to
Yeah.
DOL that it has to be uploaded in English. I wouldn't worry about that. It's more so of following the path of what the DOL requires.
Google translates a thing, they can have fun with it.
Any other questions? So a few other things. Friday, December 1st is our first holiday happy hour. So our first little holiday party since COVID. So I hope to see you guys all there. It's going to be at River Rock. We are offering this class again on December 12th and December 19th. John L. Scott is also putting together a 3-hour class regarding this. It hasn't been approved yet. They're hoping that they can do it on December 6th, but I'm not sure. I'm scheduled to be there if it's available. And then Michelle and I are also taking a required course from Annie Fitzsimmons, similar to what you guys took on October 4th, but it's for managers and owners. So the more information that we find out, and if there's anything that's earth-shattering that could really help, we will let you know right away. We will also be sending out an email towards the end of the year about what to do in different transaction scenarios. So if you have an active listing, if you have a buyer that's pending, I think that's going to be I don't want to say challenging, but if you have a pending buyer, you need to get a 41 signed. Anything else? All right.
Wait, we got a question here. Sorry, the long one. From Curtis, are there any discussions occurring to change lending regulations to allow financing compensation paid by a buyer to allow those with loan down payment programs to afford buying properties with low or no selling office commission?
Not to my knowledge. All right, anything else? All right, if you guys have questions, Michelle and I are always here to help. Thank you so much for coming. And we have a list of these questions, so we'll run it past the attorney. And we have a list of who attended the class, so we'll get that back out to the group. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Idea of,
I do.
Thanks so much.